Welcome everyone to this final CIVIS Gender Studies Lecture Series event. So we have had several events across the years, and this is the final event of 2023. My name is Francesca Stella. I'm a senior lecturer in sociology at the University of Glasgow, and it is a great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Sam Lawton, who is a tutor in sociology, and he's just recently completed his PhD, and he will talk to us today about his PhD research. Sam's research interests include the sociology of sexuality and gender, queer politics, political sociology, and the digital social world. Sam teaches sociology and research methods, and he has authored already several papers or Psychology of Sexuality's Review, and he has been involved in a project called Bisexuality Today, Understanding Attitudes, Protective Factors and Risk Factors for an Often Invisible Sexual Minority. He's also currently working on a paper on migrant working men's masculinities with another of our former PhD students, Panos Theodoropoulos. So the format of the seminar, for those of you who are here for the first time, is we're going to leave the floor to Sam, and he's going to talk for about 30 minutes. And then there's going to be plenty of time for questions, comments, and answers. And we're going to finish sharply at 5. Without further ado, over to you, Sam. So I'm really looking forward to your talk.
Grazie mille, Francesca, and grazie mille to Marcella as well for organising. Welcome, everybody. Yes, my talk is entitled British Bi+ Men and Their Intimate Partners, Identities, Relationships and Prejudice. Some of you may not be familiar with this particular term, Bi+. So this is to do with bisexuality. So bisexuality is a bit of an umbrella term for particular sexual identities. So some people use pansexual, queer, plurisexual sometimes. So we use this term Bi+ to encompass those kind of more expansive definitions of bisexual and other kind of like plurisexual identities. So yeah, my name is Dr. Sam Lawton. My pronouns are he, him, and yeah, you've heard enough about me anyway. So I'll just continue with the content of the talk. Okay, so this is a kind of introduction to the work. So in the kind of feminist tradition, I would like to give you a kind of a personal and political introduction to my work. So on the personal side, I am somebody who grew up sort of between two different parts of the UK. So I was born in Brighton, which is kind of known as the gay capital of England, and I grew up in Wales, in Swansea, which is a kind of a smaller suburban sort of seaside town. And I kind of, growing up, I sort of noticed the differences between this kind of like quite liberal metropolis that is Brighton and Swansea as well, which was South Wales as a place as a little bit more socially conservative in the time that I was growing up. This was, for some of you who don't know, we had Section 28, which involved, it was a kind of censoring any kind of, it was ostensibly the promotion of homosexuality. So what it meant was that it was forbidden to sort of discuss anything LGBT related in the UK until 2005. So this had kind of implications, long-lasting implications. In fact, there's some research showing that teachers around the kind of time that I was in school didn't actually know about the repeal. So that sort of had an influence on my growing up as a bisexual person. That's something else I should point out as well. My own relationship had an impact on the particular work that I'm doing, which is around relationships. So initially, when I proposed the research, I was going to interview bisexual men and their partners separately, but then I realized that there was a kind of shared understanding, a kind of shared epistemological space that happens within relationships, and then this influenced me into kind of taking a more collaborative approach with bisexual men and their partners, which I'll discuss a little bit later. This was also a kind of pivoting from a kind of outsider perspective where I was studying asexuality. So I'm not an asexual person myself, but I had written 2 dissertations about asexuality, and moving from an insider perspective as a bisexual person studying other bisexual people. So in terms of the kind of political introduction to my work, we stand at a very kind of paradoxical social, political, and sexual landscape in the 21st century. So Jeffrey Weeks discusses this in his book, The World We Have Won. And it's, whilst we're seeing this, we've seen hard fought, the realization of gay and lesbian rights, with things like in the UK, the right to adopt as a gay and lesbian couple, also the right to same-sex marriage, and before that, the Civil Partnership Act. That, we're still seeing a kind of complicated landscape, particularly in this kind of post-Brexit, post-Trump resurgence of right-wing populism that often carries with it very socially conservative attitudes. To kind of like put this in a more historical perspective, I like to call this the end of history. This famous book by Francis Fukuyama, arguing that we're seeing the kind of final form of government as a kind of liberal democracy. I think this thesis has been really not proven to be correct in this kind of landscape of like I said, post-Brexit, post-Trump, post-Bolsonaro, post-Law and Justice in Poland, for example. I'm currently talking to you from Amsterdam, where there's just been Geert Wilders' party has just come into power. We're seeing this kind of resurgence of right-wing populism. And with that, we've also seen the redeployment of what were termed in the kind of 1990s new right discourses, which were being used against gays and lesbians. So this idea of groomers, for example, this is all being repurposed against trans people. So these were kind of my concerns going into the thesis. And I was curious as to see how these played out with bisexual people. So a bit more about bisexuality. It's surprisingly but notoriously difficult to define. So I would say most bisexual people, including myself, define it as attraction to more than one gender rather than as an attraction to just men and women. So there's this famous paper by David Halperin, which is 13 ways of defining a bisexual person. So it's a very kind of diverse sexual identity. So I really wanted to capture some of that diversity in my thesis. So I used this expansive participant-led definition of bisexuality. So I was really curious as to hear people's own perspectives on how they define bisexuality. But I still required them to identify as bisexual. There's a kind of there's a tendency in, for example, the health literature to use this idea of men who have sex with men, which can sort of collapse gay men in with bisexual men, and bisexual writers have kind of combated this. Why I was specifically interested in bisexual men, other than being a bisexual man myself, bisexual men are less studied than bisexual women. This is something that's argued by Claire Hemmings, who's a key author of a book called Bisexual Spaces. And attitudinal studies, again, show that there's a kind of paradox here in that bisexual men are, these are kind of large-scale, nationally representative studies, which take place usually in the United States of America. But it shows that bisexual men are kind of consistently rated less favorably compared to bisexual women, gay men, and lesbians. These are quite consistent findings, although, as I said, it is limited to the US. Specifically, I was interested in relationships because they're a kind of major site where sexuality is actually enacted and performed. And they're also a major site of prejudice, and many discourses around bisexuality relate to relationships. So the idea of the bisexual person as an unfaithful partner, for example, or as promiscuous or hypersexual. These kind of relate to relationships. Sorry. Also, bisexual people often feel erased in monogamous relationships, and there's a kind of it's difficult to kind of perform bisexuality or be understood as bisexual if you are appearing in a monogamous relationship, whether that's with a partner of any gender. So also, there was a tendency in the literature to explore bisexual men's relationships from women's perspective. So there's a book by Maria Pallotta Fioroli, who actually has a book which is subtitled By Men, By Women, which explores women's relationships with bisexual men. So I'm not doing this as a criticism, it's a very good book. But I like to see my work as a kind of companion piece to this, of kind of exploring bisexual men's relationships from men's perspectives. So in terms of bi-negativity, you might have heard the term like biphobia. I prefer the term bi-negativity, and this is the word that's kind of more consistently used in literature. Homophobia is kind of not the same as the prejudice which is experienced by bisexual people. There's a term which is double discrimination, which refers to prejudice from both the gay and lesbian communities towards bisexual people, arguing that that bisexuality isn't real, or it's the invasion of heterosexual people into queer spaces, but also the dual discrimination of wider heteronormative societies and expectations, which we'll explore a little bit further in my findings section. So many of the stereotypes of bisexual men are sort of hangovers from discourses which arose during the AIDS pandemic. So the idea of the hypersexual, promiscuous, unfaithful person, particularly bisexual men, as a kind of gateway between the gay and straight worlds. There was a huge sort of panic around. You can see this in women's magazines at the time. In particular, that there was anxiety around there was no way of knowing that if you had a bisexual partner, that they might be a route to infection. So a lot of the kind of the stereotypes rely on these particular kinds of discourses. But paradoxically, I kind of want to argue that we sort of must resist stereotypes that reify conservative notions of sexuality or gender. So there's kind of I don't think there's particularly anything wrong with promiscuity, and I don't want to kind of duplicate these, as I said, these kind of conservative and right-wing talking points. And many of the discourses used to denigrate bisexuals are also anti-trans discourses. So they rely on the kind of like fixity of gender and the binary of gender, or they're kind of against non-monogamous or polyamorous relationships as well. So I think it's important to not take this, not to kind of take this avenue when we're thinking about stereotypes towards bisexual people. So part of what I did for my thesis was develop a typology of binegativity. So I looked at all the different types of binegativity. So there's invisibility, which I've discussed already a little bit. So it's very difficult to represent bisexuality. And if you want to look at some kind of media representation of bisexuality, which is very important, I would highly recommend my colleague, Dr. Jacob Engelberg, who's actually who's a professor of film studies here at Amsterdam University, who looks at cinematic figurations of bisexual transgression. That was his thesis. But it's very difficult to either visually represent bisexuality or to sort of represent bisexuality in everyday life. There's not this kind of repertoire, performative repertoire, or there are not kind of the same visual identifiers. Nikki Hayfield has done some research into this as well. In contrast to invisibility, erasure is where I would say bisexuality has been kind of written out of either knowledge or history, particularly LGBT history. There has been a kind of tendency to erase bisexual figures from gay rights history, for example. There's also this crucial term, monosexism. So monosexism refers to the privileging of the position where one person. Sorry, let me start again. It's the privileging of the idea that you are attracted to one gender. So whether that is attraction towards like same-sex attraction or similar gendered attraction, or whether this is kind of heterosexual attraction. This is actually a really crucial point, because a lot of kind of gay rights discourse from the 2000s onwards, I would say, is premised, a lot of, not all obviously, but a lot of the kind of campaigns for things like same-sex marriage, for example, were premised on this notion of similarity. Was the idea that love is love, and that lesbian and gay people were fundamentally similar and were fighting for these kind of equal rights to heterosexual people. So this is where this discourse of monosexism actually gets baked into a lot of gay rights policy and laws that gets passed. There's also the notion of heteronormativity, so the idea that heterosexuality is the norm in our societies. So where does kind of masculinity come into this? So some of you may be familiar with the work of Raymond Connell, who discusses the notion of hegemonic masculinity. So within this framework, bisexual men would possess a subordinate masculinity, but this may vary by local contexts. But really what I sought to critique, although I don't think Connell's framework can explain everything, I was really seeking to critique this notion of inclusive masculinity, which has become the kind of dominant framework of looking at masculinity in the kind of English-speaking literature. So this is premised on the notion that masculinity is changing and it's becoming more inclusive, with more kind of opportunities for emotional intimacy between men, physicality between men, and kind of resistance to things like homophobia and sexism. This influenced the largest qualitative study of bisexual men, which is called The Changing Dynamics of Bisexual Men's Lives, which contains interviews with 90 American and UK bisexual men. So before I move on to discussing that, this is Anderson's. So Eric Anderson is the kind of originator of this theory, and it's very contentious, I would say, and I think that we kind of need to be careful and kind of critique this. It relies largely on relationships between men rather than looking at relationships, men's relationship with women, which I think is kind of the fundamental aspect of masculinity, and that's something that Connell argues for. And yeah, I think it lacks a lot of intersectionality as well. So moving on to the changing dynamics of bisexual men's lives, this is the kind of the book that I was really critiquing, which uses this kind of discourse of inclusive masculinity to kind of reframe bisexual men's experiences. This is kind of premised on the idea of homohysteria. So this and inclusive masculinity. So homohysteria refers to the fear of being perceived as gay at certain points in time. So Anderson argues that during the 1980s, at the height of the AIDS pandemic, homohysteria was at its height, but it's since been kind of declining. And he argues in quite broad terms that this has been declining in the West in general. So obviously there's kind of problems around this framing. But the problem specific to the changing dynamics of bisexual men's lives, it has this unusual sampling strategy. They literally took to the streets and asked bisexual, they had a sign saying, if you're a bisexual man, we want to talk to you, which is kind of unusual. So I think this may have biased the sample somewhat, as it may be that only people, the most kind of privileged or most comfortable people would end up talking to them. And I think the book uses kind of largely positivist language despite being a sort of qualitative study. So have been kind of different attempts to frame masculinities, most recently Dimitri's theory of hybrid masculinities. And this kind of argues that masculinity is changing, but that the underlying power structures remain the same. So it's actually arguing that masculinity is kind of changing in the ways that Anderson describes, but in order to retain power, essentially, rather than eschew power. So my methodology, I conducted semi-structured interviews with 25 bisexual men and their partners. So this was 17 partnerships. I use the term partnerships here because around half of these were non-monogamous partnerships. The average age of the participants was 28. So the youngest was 19 and the oldest 42 years old. So quite a young sample relatively. There's 13 people from Scotland, 10 from England, and 2 from Wales. This is why I use the term British rather than UK, because it doesn't include Northern Ireland. Some people were interviewed together, some people were interviewed alone, and there were no more than 2 people to an interview, unfortunately. So in terms of the non-monogamous partnerships. Interestingly, most partners also identified as bisexual, I would say almost all. And as I said before, half the relationships were non-monogamous. I used interpretive phenomenological analysis, which allows for the kind of hermeneutic capture of this kind of researcher, participant, and participant relationship. So it's about the interpretation of other people's experiences, and it's called something called the double hermeneutic. So it's about my interpretation of the participants' interpretation of their relationship, and also captures both of the participants' kind of interpretations of their own relationship. And bracketing was really useful for kind of breaking these phenomenological points of reference down. It was also very useful for me as a bisexual person to kind of bracket off parts of the interviews where I was influenced by that. I also used this strategy because I didn't want to bias the results relating to prejudice with regards, because I was very interested in kind of testing this idea of inclusive masculinity and whether it was present in the sample or not. So I didn't actually ask any overt questions about prejudice in my thesis. There are just a couple of points here. So despite my attempts to recruit from more rural areas, most people lived in urban or suburban areas, and only 2 people of color were recruited. And there needs to be a lot more research done into bisexual people of color. So moving on to the results. So the first theme was all kind of surrounding bisexual identities. The definitions ranged from quite simple or binary. So, as I've said, some people identified themselves as bisexual because they were attracted to more than one gender, or that they said that they were attracted to men and women. Some were quite complex and used, for example, Robin Ochs's definition, which is quite a famous definition, which I kind of won't repeat for time. And many participants didn't strictly define themselves to one label. So many people chose to identify with at least two labels. So there was one particular participant who was describing who described themselves as bisexual and pansexual, because they kind of had quite expansive notions of what their sexuality was. Whereas their partner just identified as bisexual because they were attracted to masculinity and femininity, regardless of gender. There was also queer as another identity label, which I'll come back to a little bit. There was some kind of desire for post-political identities. Many people were kind of involved in activism around, so there was initial desire, by some people for this kind of what I call post-political identities. So these were identities that were, they described it as, I wish I could just say that I was bisexual, and people would just view it in the same way as me liking a particular sport or having a particular hobby. Whereas other people specifically identified as queer because of the political connotations that were involved in that. Many people were involved in activism, either LGBT queer activism or bisexual specific activism. Sexuality was consistently defined as resisting transphobia. So it's what it resisted what I called etymological transphobia. So there's been this kind of argument for a while that bisexuality is kind of transphobic because it has the bi label, implying that there's only two there's only two binary genders. Pretty much everybody I spoke to resisted this, and they brought this up even without kind of probing when I just asked them to define bisexuality. So bisexuality was defined often in this kind of like this political space, really. Many people just identified as bisexual because they felt that it was right or that it was a good fit. So kind of these feelings of kind of safety around the label, or that it was just it was just a good fit for them. Many people kind of came out because they said they didn't want to lie. So they came out not as these kind of like overt acts of sort of self-actualization, but when they were asked about it, they simply didn't want to lie, either to their families. So it was a kind of way that they felt that they were developing an authentic identity, through this kind of social construction with their family. And interestingly, bisexuality was seen as a kind of default way of thinking by the trans participants that I interviewed. And yeah, that was particularly interesting because it kind of revealed perhaps a different way of thinking about gender that is kind of shared by trans and bi people. So apologies if I'm going over it a little bit. So in terms of bi-negativity, despite me not asking any overt questions about prejudice, all participants reported having to deal with sexual prejudice in one way or another. So this was notable even in LGBTQ-friendly cities. So I mentioned Brighton, for example. One participant I interviewed reported the fear of holding their partner's hand in Brighton, which is probably one of the most liberal cities, and actually being shouted at, I believe, with homophobic abuse in Brighton. And there were kind of instances of violence, for example, in Manchester. Somebody got stones thrown at them. So this was very surprising and quite shocking for me, really. Manchester Manchester is known because it has a gay village in it in the United Kingdom. I would say that you could kind of categorize the prejudice between unknown and known prejudice. So unknown acts of prejudice were often anonymous in public spaces, usually involved some kind of verbal or physical violence, and was to a large extent homophobic and was explicit. This is kind of contrasted with known prejudice. So this came from family members. It was usually in private spaces and involved epistemic injustices. So these are kind of injustices of knowledge or stereotypes. So evoking these kind of stereotypes against bisexual people, and was often implicit. So it maybe wasn't overt act of kind of hostility. And there was this kind of endurance of discrimination, but it was quite complex as well. So there was somebody who noted that they were in the army before they were before you were allowed to be open about your sexuality. If you weren't heterosexual in the army, and they kind of came out of the army and kind of like explored their sexuality a bit, entered some queer spaces and faced some quite fierce resistance to their bisexuality in those spaces. So it was quite interesting kind of seeing that. So often the spaces sort of reaffirmed sort of that homosexual and heterosexual binary in these queer spaces. And as such, experiences of gay pride events or LGBT pride events were not always easy. So that was quite difficult for a lot of particularly partners, men who had partnered with women. That was kind of an uneasy, often uneasy experiences at Pride. And these were all very into kind of my typology, although I think I did quite a good job at sort of spelling these different things out. They were very interlinked and very entangled. So in terms of the relationships, which was another big theme, often relationships involving families and intimate partners were about negotiating heteronormativity. So it was usually as partners negotiating the heteronormativity that was inherent in people's families. And these actually had reflections on people's partner choice as well. So there were a lot of heteronormative expectations from families, specifically about reproduction, of how families get reproduced. So people sort of revealed that although there are increased rights for same-sex couples to adopt, families were worried that if they partnered, so that if a man partnered with a man, for example, that would mean that they wouldn't have any grandchildren. Basically, this was a kind of a real heteronormative expectation. Somebody's mother said to them actually explicitly, they were like, you better make sure you can have all partners of all different genders, but you better make sure the last one is a woman, basically, so that I can have grandchildren. And some of these expectations did shape partner choice as well. So there was Jack, who was a participant, described their families being quite religious, and they said that because of this, they weren't out of their family at the time of interview, and they were explaining to me that it was quite difficult to negotiate this, essentially. And they realized that they had been kind of choosing partners that they could introduce to their family, and they had been kind of avoiding this, and that was something they were kind of negotiating with their partner currently. Often with families as well, there was what I call a burden of education, and this was regardless of political persuasion. So some people described their parents as being very gay and lesbian friendly. One person just said that, you know, basically his sort of godfather figure, not exactly, but was, you know, was a gay man, and yet his mother really had a lot of misconceptions about bisexuality and what it meant. She thought it was a kind of transition phase to coming out as a gay man. And this kind of exposed the kind of misconceptions and erasure of bi knowledge from wider LGBT discourse. So how it's kind of siloed away these kind of discourses about bisexuality, and, you know, revealed the kind of discourses that are spread in kind of sort of the popular understanding of bisexuality are largely shaped by stereotypes, essentially. And there was some resentment having to be the kind of knowledge bringer and be the active participant in educating their families about bisexuality. Also, the kind of final theme was around, kind of in contrast, it was to do with intimate partner relationships, and pretty much everybody said that what the positive influence of bisexuality on their partnership were, essentially. So there were sites of kind of like safety, because there was a kind of shared understanding. As I said, most people did have a partner who was also bisexual, and these were kind of spaces from which life experiments kind of could occur, essentially. So this is taken from a book, again co-authored by Jeffrey Weeks, the Sim Life Experiments. So these involved coming out, particularly bisexual men who are partnered with women who are also bisexual. As I noted before, there's these kind of there maybe aren't as many strongly negative attitudes towards bisexual women, and I think this helped if they partnered with an already out bisexual woman. They were able to kind of negotiate their own coming out, and in some cases, just more broadly, negotiate non-monogamous relationships as part of that, because they were kind of figuring out what coming out meant in terms of that, but also wanting to be in this relationship and yeah, having to negotiate all those different things. And I could see that there were kind of there were attempts, at least, at negotiating more kind of egalitarian relationships that weren't shaped by so many heteronormative and kind of gender role expectations. As I said, these were mostly with other bisexual people. Some people relayed the bad experiences that they had with their previous partners, but pretty much everybody commented that there was kind of less jealousy and kind of more flexibility in these particular relationships. So just to sum up, sorry, I know I've gone over a little bit. I hope that's okay. So I would say that bisexual men and their partners' lives are still overshadowed by negativity, and this kind of counters Anderson and others' claims that homophobia and bi negativity are declining. Basically, that both of these claims have been made. And I think my research exposes that there remains a kind of a lack of knowledge about bisexuality in wider popular discourse. And this really affects bisexual people's everyday lives. I think that hybrid masculinities are maybe a better conceptual framework than inclusive masculinity for understanding bisexual men, although you could kind of argue either way for understanding bisexual men themselves. But I think hegemonic masculinity still has a part to play in understanding the prejudice that is faced by bisexual men. So there's still, within relationships, maybe those masculinities that are being performed are more inclusive. But I think that outside of, as soon as you kind of like, you know, leave your home, for example, it's very different, and you have to negotiate a lot of different things as a result of that. And I found essentially that intimate relationships are really important sites of identity development for bisexual men, and this reframes the prejudice experienced by bisexual people in romantic relationships as kind of barriers to identity and self-becoming themselves, rather than just simply as stereotypes that they have to negotiate. So what is being denied to to bisexual people as a result of these stereotypes. Well, it might actually be, identity development itself. You may not even come out as a bisexual person, if they had not been, or you may not have come out as early, had it not been for relationships. That would certainly be the case for a lot of my participants. And also, I kind of know I want to end on, we need to be careful about how claims for justice are being articulated in a climate that is increasingly characterized by social conservatism and anti-trans rhetoric. And I'm really pleased to see that a lot of critical work on this is being done by colleagues in Europe. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks very much for a very interesting talk, Sam. I'm sure that everyone in the audience has got lots of questions. So I would like to open it up first of all. I've got some questions myself, but I think someone else goes first. So do you have any comments or questions or for Sam? You can either put the video on and actually, speak to the camera so we can see you. That would be nice because it makes it feel a little bit more personal. But if you prefer not to do it, then you can put your question or comment in the chat. Yeah, Emil.
Hi. Thank you so much, Sam. This was really interesting. I learned a lot. Could you say something about the conclusion? And sorry if I missed this previously in the presentation, but you in the conclusion you said that you think that hybrid masculinities is a better concept than inclusive masculinities, especially related to bisexual men. Why? Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. I mentioned this partly has to do with research design. I think that because I didn't interview people differently, and I want to, I think it's good to be a little bit skeptical, maybe. Like, it would be interesting to see how some of my participants have been in relationships for a really long time, but I don't think anybody's going to kind of necessarily talk about, or people didn't really necessarily critically reflect on their role as a man within their relationships, other than by saying all the egalitarian things that they did do. So it would have been maybe interesting to kind of hear their partner's perspective alone on that. Obviously, I want to take people on face value. As somebody who's previously studied psychology, I find that discipline maybe a little bit something that is overly skeptical of people. I think it's okay to just ask people, and I don't think that most people are gonna kind of lie. Although I do think social desirability has a part to play. So I think that would be something that I would kind of caution, maybe. If you took it on face value, maybe you could just say, oh well, these were perfect examples of inclusive masculinity. But I don't think that obviously that's the framework that I'm very, very critical of. So I think, yeah. Do you kind of understand where I'm coming from in terms of this? I think there are a kind of stronger and weaker versions of my conclusion, and I kind of want to maybe be a little bit more cautious in terms of that.
Thank you.
Thanks for your question.
Is it okay to just follow up from that? Because I also had a question about this, and I think it's, your talk is really fascinating. There's lots of different points that come up that relate to these concepts of hegemonic, inclusive, hybrid masculinities. But I wonder, if there's scope maybe for you to elaborate a little bit more on these relationships, and it's something that maybe you could think about as a future publication or something. And particularly, if I remember well, the kind of notion of hegemonic masculinity is centered around the fact that this ideal of hegemonic masculinities to which men aspire to is very strongly based on homophobia and the exclusion and marginalization of gay men. So, I think, when you were answering Emil's question, I think you were talking more about, egalitarianism as a dimension of these relationships with, other bisexuals, mainly of various genders. But I wonder, how does that relate to that notion of hegemonic masculinity? So I suppose Anderson's argument, I don't really like his work very much, I have to say, but I think his argument about gay men is that, they have been included in this more egalitarian notion of masculinity. So is that true of bisexual men? Is, what was there a gender dimension to their experiences of marginalization or misrecognition? So was, their relationship with other men crucial to that? I don't know if my question.
No, I understand. So it's interesting because I think bisexual invisibility has a lot to do with this as well, of when people are being sort of misrecognized as not as bisexual. Like I said, it has to do with this kind of like notion of known and unknown prejudices, essentially. So there's an example where there was one person was like skipping and like holding hands with their partner walking down the street, and they received kind of like homophobic comments towards them. So it was obviously a misrecognition of them as a gay person, despite the fact that they were sort of like with their partner. And it's because they were sort of violating these notions of hegemonic masculinity that got targeted towards them. So as I said, I think it's essentially, relationships with these places that in maybe like more private or domestic spaces, there could be these kind of avenues to kind of explore. And some people talked about like sharing clothes with their partners, for example, or just those spaces as being kind of like sites for exploration and safety a little bit more. But then this was kind of complicated, and this is where hegemonic masculinity goes into it as well. Also, because they were in public spaces, there's also this kind of like Borgesian notion of a call to order as well, of those public spaces being kind of spaces in which masculinity is kind of evaluated as well. And then it's brought to order through this kind of like homophobia as well. So it's also, again, this doesn't necessarily, because you've got this idea of like double discrimination as well. The inclusive masculinities thing kind of falls apart because of this notion of double discrimination. Again, people would go to pride parades and be misrecognized as a heterosexual couple who, it was quite interesting actually, there was this gender dimension because their partners were often recognized as bisexual women, but they themselves were not recognized as bisexual men. So that was something that was like singled out at a particular pride event, and something that somebody actually had like an organizing role in as well. So that was quite interesting. I thought hopefully that answered your question a little bit, Francesca.
Yeah, thanks. Lots of really interesting points there. There's a couple of questions in the chat, so I'm just going to read them to you one by one, perhaps. So the first one from Eden is whether there were any specific or surprising differences between cis and trans bisexualities as they were defined by the participants outside of bi identities being seen as the default in trans relationships, where trans bi relationships more often both bi and T4T.
Yeah, that's trans for trans. Yes. So it was interesting in that. So I had a particular participant who's a member of, they're a trans man and they're a member of a LGBTQ rugby team. And as a part of this, they their masculinity wasn't called into question. They were included as part of this rugby team. But because this was a very masculine space, they were reluctant to bring up their bisexuality because they thought it would be excluded because of the particular aspects that femininity brought with that, or that attraction to feminine people that brought with their bisexuality. So that was kind of interesting as well, to notice that. And were trans bi relationships more often both bi and TFT? I wouldn't necessarily say to you. I would say it was kind of like, it was quite mixed. I had quite a small, I can't really speak that much, but there were only kind of, I think, 5 of my participants. So I'm kind of reluctant to make big sweeping claims about that. But it was certainly seen by trans people who did identify as bi, that a bisexual partner was like a safer bet, perhaps. So more, and was not necessarily T for T, but there was a kind of a mix.
Okay, thank you. The second question from Sylvia is, how can future research help to address the gaps identified in the popular discourse on bisexuality, and what methodologies or frameworks could be used to improve our understanding of the complexities surrounding hybrid masculinities, hegemonist masculinity, and bisexuality among bisexual men? I think there's 2 questions in there.
This is a great question. So there is a very useful thing. Let me just share my screen because this is useful. So in 2012, a bunch of bi researchers and activists put together guidelines for researching and writing about bisexuality. So I would say that is a great place to start. I think there's other references as well which we can use, which I'll maybe post in the chat after this. But it's really about treating bisexuality as something in and of itself. So is a kind of I've mentioned the tendency in the kind of health literature to collapse any kind of similar gendered attraction into like one category, but this also goes for the notion of like LGBT or even queer, right? We use these kind of like terms of as categories of analysis, but really we need to be kind of careful to study even like bi plus, right, is this big, is this big category in and of itself. I think bisexuality is probably one of the most diverse sexualities within within like the LGBT umbrella, essentially. So I think it's just having this kind of like rich qualitative understanding of what bisexuality is, and taking this kind of like everyday life approach to it. That's kind of like what I was most influenced by, was the kind of sociology of everyday life, of how can we kind of like address those kind of gaps on the popular discourse of bisexuality. I think just having, when we think about like education about sexualities, like how much are we really delving into the differences? Are we treating queer people as as just like a singular entity, or are we actually really talking richly about the diversity of those particular things? And I think qualitative methodologies are particularly good at using at exploring those questions. But also, if you are doing quantitative research, if you are doing research on LGBT people, make sure that you can actually access the statistics about bisexuality, because that's so often like I said, collapsed with with MSM, for example. Can you actually separate out people into distinct entities, or are you kind of like treating those as as separate kind of entities?
Thanks. There is a lovely comment from Luca in the chat, which I think you should read. It's a lovely comment. We don't have a lot of time left. There's one final question from Mariana, which I don't know, you may be able to answer it very briefly. So she is an architect and she's interested in people's experiences of queer spaces and queer cities. And you mentioned that some of the people that you interviewed mentioned issues around safety and feeling unsafe and so on. So the question is, would they talk more generally about cultural aspects or stereotypes, or could they identify spatial or physical dimensions to these kind of feelings of unsafety?
That's a really good question. First of all, I do want to thank Luca for their comment. That's really nice. Yeah, this is so when you think about kind of like early like queer spaces, for example, they might have, if you think about like a gay bar, for example, it's quite a masculine space, and that is the way that but because of this kind of like and you still see this in kind of older gay establishments, for example, it's actually the ways that the fixity, this kind of like monosexism, which is what I'm going back to, kind of regulates this space. As my colleague Helen Bush-Catton has done a lot about this idea of bispaces being kind of heterotopias, as well, using this kind of Foucauldian notion of sort of other spaces. And there, I think that bispaces, maybe there aren't these kind of, these like institutional kind of like lasting like bispaces. It's always, sort of, they've maybe been part of kind of queer spaces, or part of gay rights movements, but have maybe had those things sort of like marginalized. It's difficult. It's hard to like point to, well, this is a bispace. They tend to have these kind of like temporary characteristics. So like my colleague Helen Bush-Catton looked at BICON, for example, which is a kind of like large bisexual conference or convention. I think Bi Pride in the UK was like virtual I think it started as a kind of virtual thing during the pandemic. I could be wrong about that, so sorry if there's anybody from BICON watching this and I've misrepresented your space, but yeah, it's ephemeral. I would say there's a good research being done by Emil Malapart on this, who talks about spaces being made by spaces simply by the sort of linguistic enunciation of one's bisexuality, and kind of like reclaiming that as well. I'm kind of maybe a little bit skeptical of that. I do really like his research, and kind of because these kind of because there aren't these kind of like fixed bispaces. But again, I'm kind of like critical of the idea of there have to be like institutional sort of like pillars with a sign that saying bisexual space on it as well. That's kind of like the anarchist in me, I suppose, of like not wanting these fixed spaces. So it's complicated, but it's interesting that they're characterized usually by their ephemerality or by their temporariness as well. That's something I kind of talk about in terms of bispaces. Thank you for your comment. There is it's really interesting and really good.
Thank you for your answer.
Thanks, Sam, and thanks everyone who took part in this seminar, which was really interesting, and we had lots of really interesting questions, so lots of food for thought. So just to conclude, Well, this is the last seminar of the semester, and there's a bit of a question mark, as Marcella mentioned, about what's happening next year, but hopefully these seminars will continue, so we'll keep you posted. And for the moment, well, I hope you have a wonderful break over the holidays, and we'll be in touch, I suppose, at some point in the new year. So thank you very much. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Grazie mille, buonanotte.